Hello and welcome to the Business of the Business podcast. I am your co-host, JP John Paz. With me, of course, is my co-host, the financial wrestling genius himself, Lavi Margaret. Lavi, how you doing today, sir?
Hey, John, I'm doing good. A special day, bringing back one of our most prolific guests, Brandon Thurston of WrestleNomics. Welcome, Brandon.
Hello, John and Lavi. It's great to be back.
I think this is the fourth time for Brandon, at least on Business of the Business. I know I've interviewed him a few times myself, so a very, very frequent guest. We love him here talking Business of the Business.
Am I the most frequent guest?
Yes,
Brandon has forgiven me for supporting the Chiefs just because I wanted to see the Super Bowl record broken. And it's between you and Brett Lauderdale. I usually do the math before you come on, but I didn't get the chance.
That's right. I was very upset about your support of the Kansas City Chiefs, but I can understand. I will forgive you for the fact that you were motivated by wanting to see what the ratings would be like if Taylor Swift was a part of the Super Bowl, which she ended up being, and it did break the record. So I can. I'm still upset about it, but I'll get past it someday.
Appreciate it.
Now, as far as business of the business is concerned, of course, ratings are always a big topic. What about Netflix, WWE, that deal? And what was it like, Brendan? Because Vince McMahon allegations came out that same week. So what was that week like for you? Because that was nuts.
That was a busy week. There were, we did John Pollock and I did a breaking news. I don't know what we did. I think we did breaking news for the Netflix story breaking, which was, I believe, Tuesday, which was also the same day that they announced that Dwayne Johnson is a new member of the TKO board.
Yep.
And then 2 days later, on the Thursday, Janelle Grant's lawsuit came out. In fact, as we're recording today, I believe the defendants are due to respond today. So I'm watching my email to see if any alerts come in. But it was a very busy time. I apologize to anyone whose messages I may have missed, who may be listening right now.
Man, what an insane week. When you look at it, it's like, okay, $5 billion deal. The Rock's on board. He's an equity stake owner in the company. They're at an all-time high. Then Vince comes in and it all comes crashing down. Did that end up hurting stock and the business for the week? Because it probably started out on a high. Did it end up hurting it when the week was over?
No, not really. The thing that would have hurt it is the Slim Jim news that Slim Jim was pulling out as a sponsor of Royal Rumble. But by the time that they confirmed that, the market had closed for Friday. And it's Friday, so the market didn't open the following morning because it was Saturday, and they announced that they were back anyway. Long story short, TKO stock has not been affected by the bad news surrounding WWE and Vince McMahon. This is a lawsuit against WWE as well, in addition to Vince McMahon and John Laurinaitis. But this is not, if you look at the stock, I've not looked at it actually today, but I was looking at it yesterday, and there's a jump for the timing of the Netflix deal. There's a little bit of a downward trend after that, but there's, this is a stock that looks like it's been slightly improved by the Netflix deal, and you would know nothing else by just looking at the line chart.
I know TKO, UFC, WWE, they're together, but is WWE now worth more than UFC after the Netflix deal?
No, I would say no. The Netflix deal is an okay deal for them. Netflix is a great brand that everyone's excited about, for good reason. Netflix is by far the leading streamer, and if you're going to put one of your core programs on a streaming service, exclusively on a streaming service, Netflix is the one that you want. And we'd all ruled out Netflix as pretty unlikely, just because they don't have anything like Raw, a weekly show that's live. Netflix doesn't have anything like that. They've experimented with live, but they don't have any live programs on the regular. But they're in, a comparable number of homes and possibly more homes than any cable network is at this point. So it's a cool deal for that reason. As far as money, though, this is not a huge money deal relative to what they already had. Now it's $500 million average annual value, but that's replacing the USA Network deal, which is $265, but it's also replacing a lot of international rights because, as we know, this is not just Raw going on Netflix in the United States, which it is, but it's also everything in the UK, in Canada, probably, I believe in India, not immediately, but within a couple of years, I think it'll take over all of the India rights. So those are their biggest international markets. What would be next? Middle East, North Africa. I think there's the deal that they have in Saudi Arabia will continue to go on and not go on Netflix, but this is overtaking a lot of rights. So in the end, I think this is like a 30% increase over their current value when you take into account all of the rights that this Netflix deal is replacing. Now you can make an argument about why this is really great news, because Netflix is a flywheel that's going to have all these downstream effects that's going to be positive for WWE, and that may be the case. But as far as just a monetary value, this is, this is not what the stock market was expecting a couple of years ago anyway, in terms of, I think we all expected like a 70% increase, maybe a doubling of these rights, 30% increase.
When you look at like just WWE's value, obviously a lot of it's Saudi Arabia, and I just noticed they open up the WWE experience in Saudi Arabia. Is that sort of any income for them, or is that strictly Saudi Arabia? Like, what's the like positive to that doing that?
I haven't thought about it very, very much. I've just seen the Triple H tweets of like a graveyard. Undertaker seems to love Saudi Arabia. He goes there all the time. I saw he was doing like a soccer ceremony with a trophy and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit on the nose to put a WWE graveyard, tourist attraction in Saudi Arabia. But it's a good question. Is there any money surrounding that? WWE doesn't do things like that for free, so it might be a small deal. I would not expect it to be like this. It doesn't look like it's a huge attraction, right? But it could be a small deal.
Now, given that they have one in Saudi Arabia, there's a little place called Orlando, Florida, that has a lot of other people coming in, in the millions throughout the years of just vacation, Disney, Universal, whatever. Why wouldn't they just do something like that here? Is there just not that much financial gain to it?
I don't know. It's something that's been discussed over the years. I think Nick Khan in one interview a couple of years ago sort of beat around the idea of maybe licensing those rights to NBC Universal. Good question. I don't know. I think there's value to be had there in maybe licensing some WIP rights to some partners for at least to make WWE part of your what would we call it, theme park.
Yeah. Yep. Now, obviously, AEW, Warner Brothers, that is still kind of out there. Who else is a player for the AEW rights? Because now that Warner Brothers was rumored with WWE, maybe didn't make them a strong offer. Maybe that was just for WWE to get more money from Netflix. I mean, who knows about how they did business to get the Netflix deal? But what about AEW and Warner Brothers? Are they still going to be in bed together? And is there a rights increase for that deal?
There better be a rights increase for that deal. Otherwise, this business doesn't make very much sense. I still think, if you look at the cost per viewer hour, basically look at the cost of WWE content and look at the ratings, take that all into account and do some math, you can still compare that to AEW and justify doubling AEW's current rights, which is, I think, around 70 million, maybe like 75 or something like that. But let's say 70 million. Maybe somebody will correct me if I'm too low. We know it's about 44 just for Dynamite and Rampage, but the addition of Collision, it's a little more. I think they're in a good position to get it probably maybe around doubled would be my, if AEW was a publicly traded company, that's what I would have in my stock analysis. And you take into consideration too that there are unmonetized rights that can be dealt in a new deal, including the pay-per-view rights, maybe next day rights, which don't have a real home in the way that W rights have a home on Hulu the next day, as well as the library. I saw in John Oran's report in one of his new newsletters that True TV is looking for more sports content. So when I think about a wrestling fan reading that, I think, oh, is Ring of Honor going to end up on True TV? I doubt it. But that's the fact that they're doing, as people might know, that Fox, Disney, and to WBD are teaming up to do this sports. People call it a streaming service, but I think it's really, it's another form of streaming cable TV. In any case, they're looking for more sports content there. So I don't know if that means anything for the AEW deal, but that's happening. But yeah, I think they're in a decent position to still get an increase for the fact that their cost per viewer hour is relatively cheap, at least compared to Raw and SmackDown. Not so much NXT though. They look fully valued if you only look at NXT. But and the fact that they have rights out here that are not being used, not being monetized in any way.
Who else is a competitor for Warner
Who
Brothers
else?
to get AEW?
Maybe Fox. Fox, the one that would make the most sense, right? Because they decided to let go SmackDown, and you could look at, if you're Fox and you feel like, well, we didn't get the value, we didn't get the revenue out of SmackDown that we wanted to based on what we're paying for it. You could look at AEW and say that's a much cheaper property. And even if you doubled their rights fee, it's still going to be much cheaper than SmackDown was, even in the current term that's ending now. So Fox makes some sense. I doubt Disney. Maybe TKO shuts that door a little bit. WBD. I think it's a possibility that not all three shows will end up still on WBD. I would be shocked if none of them ended up on WBD. But I could see Dynamite or Rampage ending up with WBD and one of the other shows going somewhere else. I think it's really interesting.
That trifecta you mentioned, Warner Brothers, Fox, and ESPN, them doing the streaming cable thing, would that actually hurt whoever is in there as far as sports are concerned? Because I heard the NBA was upset because they're worth more on their own than they would be in a group of all other sports, meaning that, hey, we've got hockey, we've got football, we don't necessarily need the NBA to make this thing work. Would that make WBD value AEW less or value UFC less, that there's so many sports going into this trifecta?
So what do you mean on their own?
Like, let's say it's just them on TBS or TNT, whatever, just NBA on that station. Does that make them more valuable if they're kind of only on one network rather than this trifecta, which has a million other sports on it?
Well, my understanding is that like TBS, TNT, ESPN are still all going to exist, and they will be channels on this service. So it'll be like Hulu Live TV, YouTube TV.
Interesting.
But it'll just be a limited number of channels. It'll be ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN Plus will be a part of this. TNT, TBS, True TV, Fox broadcast, ABC broadcast, FS1, FS2. So you'll be able to flip through the channels. So you will be able to watch Big Bang Theory reruns because you will have TBS if you subscribe to the service, right. Assuming the federal government doesn't block it.
I have a friend of mine, by the way, that's obsessed with the Big Bang Theory being the lead-in for AEW, and whoever comes out first always gets, like if you look at the rating, wow, Moxley's a huge draw. Orange Cassidy, he always messages me, goes, after reading your report, he always sends me a picture. He goes, Moxley's a big draw, not Big Bang Theory. Like, we kind of made a joke about it. Mm-hmm. How much of the lead-in is really Big Bang? Because it always is like a million, and then all of a sudden it's down.
It's huge. And it obscures my ability to analyze the first two quarters of Dynamite. I think it's really strong, and it puts a lot of noise into trying to analyze those first two quarters for sure. It's good to have, though. I mean, you want that. You don't not want that. You want a ton of viewers who are maybe not accustomed to your product to try it out.
Definitely. Is the perception of wrestling changed at all as far as mainstream, you think?
Since when? No, I don't know.
Well, now that they're getting these huge deals, they're on Fox, they're on Netflix, they're getting $1 billion deals left and right. They're on Peacock getting $1 billion deal. Do you think that it's more mainstream now, or the perception of wrestling has changed to make it more mainstream?
I think the generational gift of kids who were kids in the Hulkamania era or even the Attitude Era who grew up with wrestling, and those people becoming adults that eventually have influence in media. I think that has been responsible for some more accepting feelings around wrestling. I don't think that these media deals are cool and that's nice and everything. And I think Nick Khan coming to WWE with all of his relationships with sports media has softened and made WWE more acceptable and digestible to some of these media outlets. But I don't think it's not the case that like wrestling is looked down upon still. I still think it is. Yeah.
Does the Vince stuff make that even worse?
Yeah.
Seems like
I think it does.
Right?
I think it does. And I think it's just wrestling being wrestling makes it not as publishable for the Vince story itself to be covered, because I think it's in a place where it's sports, but it's fake sports, so sports doesn't really want to cover it, and entertainment looks at it as the lowest form of entertainment that there is, basically, so they don't really want to cover it either. And I say there is some coverage, right? There is Hollywood Reporter and Deadline, places like that will cover this to an extent. Sports media coverage of the Vince story, I can't find anywhere, I don't think. I mean, ESPN has not covered it barely at all. There's been just sort of the basics of, he resigned. There's this lawsuit out there from sports media, but not much beyond that I've seen.
Lavi, I know you're chomping at the bit to go over the annual reports.
Oh.
Yes, but I'm going to start out hot, Brandon. Big Little Brawlers. Is it going to make the charts? Can we track that? I think it's on a pretty high rated station, and it's comparable.
Was it on Discovery?
Big Little Brawlers. The show with Little Person Wrestling.
Yes, is it on the channel Discovery?
Yeah. And that's a pretty highly rated channel, and the ratings are competitive with WoW and syndication and the secondary AEW programming. So I don't know, like in your categorization, is it going to go on the massive chart, or does it sort of like, is it too periphery that stands alone? Like it's about wrestling, but it's not a wrestling show.
I haven't looked at the ratings at all, actually. So you're telling me new information, which is good. Would you call it an in-ring program though, with matches? This is like a reality show, right?
Yeah, I've never watched it. John, have you found your way to this quality program? So that's our first thing that we have to.
No, never watched it.
I think it would be like including, Ms. and Mrs. or Total Divas, which, if those programs were still going, would be doing it at least as well as WoW and Rampage and stuff like that. But it's probably not going to be a 52-week-a-year show, I guess, in terms of including it in the things that you're probably looking at with all the weekly core in-ring content programs.
So M&A in pro wrestling. So you are, I don't know if it's too much to say an insider, but certainly somebody that's...
I did get a tip. I did hear that was coming. Go ahead.
Yeah, yes, that's somebody that's certainly involved in Empire State Wrestling first as a performer, but I believe now as a backstage... I want to say fixer, but that's not the right word.
So I've not been doing that of late. I have not done that since maybe almost a year now. I have no regular role in independent wrestling or any other wrestling company.
So as somebody that's familiar but not there day to day or show to show, like what did you take this news as? Okay, like they're going to do a different market, but they need to buy the promotion. Couldn't they have run the market? Like, what does something like this mean on this level?
So what we're talking about is Empire State Wrestling has bought, which is a Buffalo-based independent wrestling company, has bought Erie, Pennsylvania-based independent wrestling company, Pro Wrestling Rampage. Both of them. If there's a number one and number two of the companies that I've worked for most often, it's probably those two. So I heard about it because Brett Mendick, should I call him? I don't know. Brett Steinmetz is his real name. He's the promoter of ESW. I texted him some garbage text while I was at Royal Rumble, and he told me about that this was going to happen. It's going to be announced soon. So, I mean, for people that don't know, Buffalo and Erie are about a 2-hour drive apart from each other. It's whatever. I mean, it's indie wrestling, so people want to run indie shows, and I have no sense of what kind of how financially this will work out for them, but that's interesting. And I think I was told that this is part of what has encouraged. Have you heard about this? There's a bill that's in New York State legislature in New York State legislation that might change the rules, which are particularly strict in New York State in terms of the expense that is burdened on independent wrestling companies to run independent wrestling shows in New York. So I was told by somebody who works for at least one of those companies that the fact that a New York promoter has bought a Pennsylvania-based company rather than run more shows in New York has encouraged support for this bill.
Yeah, not only have I heard about it, it's in the notes, and maybe I got a heads up from the same person from
Yeah, you
DJ.
probably did. Yes, I told him to make sure you knew about it.
Yeah, so Senator Patrick Gallivan is now co-sponsoring this bill. So just quickly, without belaboring the language, they're conducting a review of the need for regulation of pro wrestling. Consider the extent in which the organizations that infrequently sponsor or host a professional wrestling requires regulation at all. Consider which wrestling events that do not involve competition require regulation. Examine regulation in other states and consult with pro wrestling participants, stakeholders, and other entities. By November 1st, 2023, the Commission shall submit its report detailing its findings and recommendations under this section, the need for regulation, if some form of regulation is recommended, the minimum qualifications and oversight required to meet the regulatory standard. And it's also open for comment for those that want to go and register with New York to comment on the issue. But it seems like they're, by the language that they're leaning away from it, right? Like, is it even needed? And if it's needed, how can we do it in a minimal way? To me, like, I know, and I'd love to hear what you think because, you've been involved in this to different degrees, but as a performer and so on. But to me, when it's done right, it means protection. And that, sort of the deregulation of pro wrestling from the McMahon push in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and so on, like, to me, that opened up things to a more dangerous level. I don't know if things would tip one way or another at this point in independent pro wrestling, but not necessarily you have to take a stance, but are you for or against? But like, what do you just think about this?
I think it's an excessive financial burden that's put on New York promoters because of the commission. So just to briefly review my understanding of what the expenses are that are caused by the commission onto promoters is you have to have an ambulance there, which is a relatively new rule. And that costs money. The promoter has to pay for the ambulance. You have to pay for a doctor to be there. You have to pay for this combative insurance, which is particularly unusual relative to other commissions in the U.S., which is several hundred dollars per show. So, I mean, those are the big ones. You have to pay for a bond every year. You have to pay for a license every year. I don't know. I think like I've never heard of the combative insurance really being used in any way that I remember, and that I remember there being a beneficial story around. So I think it's an excessive requirement. I guess we think about like what could happen at wrestling shows that we should try to prevent. What's the cause for regulation? I mean, people can get hurt. Obviously, people can get hurt very badly in wrestling. It's good to have a doctor there. Maybe it's the right thing to have EMTs there, to have an ambulance there. There are rules about blading. I think it literally says in the handbook, no blading, gigging. All the terminology is used there, so it's clear what they're referring to. But like, tell me, Lavi, like, what are your concerns about like things being not safe if there's not a particular kind
yeah
of
so if you don't have to submit any medical forms, can somebody come in the ring with hepatitis or other bloodborne transferable illnesses or things like that? Does somebody need a minimum level of training? We saw all the way in Africa this week, I think the Democratic Republic of Congo, WrestleMap, who's also based in Western New York, reported that Ngamba died in the ring. But as we
that happened in the ring, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, from what I understand, it happened in the ring. The ring is actually, it looks like it's made up of a carpet. So like we were sort of celebrating. I'm not to paint the whole continent, but right, for like a week we were celebrating. Like, look at these in a different promotion. Look at these wrestlers, and they put some string and they're having a good time and whatever. But the dark side of it is in a different country but on the same continent that there's people that might not be trained properly and might not have the appropriate ring structures that can actually die. So like, should there be like I don't even know if the Athletic Commission looks at it. Is there a certain standard in terms of like structure of the ring, padding used, ropes, and so on. I'm sure there's a lot that falls on. I think that there needs to be some sort of regulation. I don't know if it needs to be an athletic commission. And then I think that there's certain things that just happen at athletic events. I don't know what the minimal standard is, even for like a high school football game these days, but an EMT, defibrillator, somebody that knows CPR, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I have been at events where representatives from the commission, which are sometimes there and sometimes not, they do look at the ring. I do remember one time a commission representative being concerned about a cage match and that the cage would not, stay up. But I think there are states that do blood testing. New York does not do blood testing. I'm not opposed to that. As far as requiring training, in theory, yes, I think there should be a minimum standard for training before anybody gets in the ring. I just find that very hard to define, and I find it I imagine it would be very prone to corruption in that, like, who gets to, how would you propose determining whether someone is legitimately trained, or do we have like certified trainers? It just sounds like, it's not a government entity trying to understand pro wrestling, and certify and standardize pro wrestling training sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
So, Brandon, this actually opens the door for something that I don't think that you talk about very much. I think you're a very humble person, and you have different worlds in pro wrestling. But if it's okay, I'd love to take a moment just to have you reflect on the career of Daniel Garcia, who you've been a part of training and have wrestled, and just sort of like a proud, maybe a proud uncle sitting back and watching week to week. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's always weird to watch him on TV. Well, so sometimes it's weird to like imagine. I was watching the thing with Adam Copeland the other Saturday, and like he's like in the ring with Edge. It's surreal. I think he's we text now and then here and there. I think he's just really, really well positioned to do well in wrestling because of a lot of factors that he came to us with, that we taught him how to wrestle. But he's I imagine, I've no strong, nobody's told me this, but I imagine he's a good person to have in the locker room, in terms of he's just a good person to get along with, and he's young, but I could see him being sort of a locker room leader type. He's a reasonable person. He's respectful. He's friendly. So I could see him. People like that tend to go a long way, and people who are assholes tend to not go very far in wrestling, despite their ability. There are many stories of that. But I think he's doing well, and I am always conscious of like the conflict of interest around like talking about somebody who I trained and now is an emerging star in wrestling. But I think he has a lot of tools to go very far, and I don't think I say that easily.
Great, thank you. Appreciate you, touching on a subject that you don't have the chance to as much. Corey Leff of John Wall Street.
Yes.
Actually, I think I learned his name just recently when he appeared on the show. He had something that like was kind of, it blew my mind, but it was sort of always out there for a long time. Meaning that this idea of TNA, and as you've covered in your report, John, which is Brandon, which is available through the WrestleNomics Patreon. If you want to get separately through PayHip, the 2023 WrestleNomics report, the best in the industry, that TNA has these massive amount of followers, even on YouTube. It's still ahead of AEW. AEW might catch up soon, of course. But the idea of fans versus followers, those that are willing to spend money and those that may just be following from a legacy. Would you subscribe to that as well? Like TNA has a lot of followers, but not necessarily fans.
I think it's the discrepancy that you're talking about between the social media touch points that TNA has versus AEW is largely just down to TNA having I don't know how many years. If you look at the age, I think you can see in a lot of cases in these social media accounts when these accounts were created, and it's probably around the birth of these platforms existing. I think it's largely that. I mean, if AEW had existed at that time, I think AEW would be well ahead of them if they, had started social media at that time. But there's some credit due to TNA for adopting those platforms and putting time into those to get the reach that those accounts have.
So New Japan in the US, which which we cover week to week pretty extensively. In Japan, it's kind of somewhat of a mystery, even going through their quarterly reports. I know that your passion for pro wrestling, one of which was Purisu, especially All Japan, but with their stock, as much as you're following Bushi Road on the Nikkei, I was going to say Wall Street Road woes, but really on the Nikkei, being down 50%, there seems to be a lot of going on operationally in the company to cause problems. What's your outlook on the company overall at the moment, and how do you think they're positioned in the US? I almost gave up on them, and then they're like, okay, we just sold 5,000 tickets to a show in Chicago.
Yeah, it really looks to me like a company that's losing all of its talent to AEW. I've had some thoughts lately about, I remember the relationship between New Japan and Ring of Honor, how we sort of felt like, it's kind of a Trojan horse situation in that, Ring of Honor was helped in the short term from their relationship with New Japan. I think you could argue that maybe they weren't helped in the long term, although maybe there were other factors with Sinclair that was going to make this sort of what Ring of Honor ended up being inevitable. But it kind of feels like it's vice versa in the case of New Japan and AEW, in that Okada is going to AEW, Will Ospreay is going to AEW. It's probably, I'm not the best person to talk about New Japan, but it's probably going to be a different era for New Japan in terms of there might be a limit to how far certain talent will go with them. If we're even seeing Japanese talent, Japanese born talent like Okada go over, and Nakamura years ago went over to other bigger US based companies. But they're definitely in a position where they need to create stars, and they have some younger wrestlers who people look to be the stars of the future that really need to start stepping up and being given the opportunity to step up.
So in taking or utilizing probably WrestleTix data in terms of events for AEW, sort of like as a different comparison point. So it seems like now, if we can look at maybe just a couple events, recent events as example, maybe New Japan in the US, if they promote it at its best and they use AEW talent, that they can be above the lowest drawing AEW shows. Is that sort of the best way to categorize it hierarchically? New Japan, in terms of its biggest guns, using AEW as well, can be just above the bottom level AEW show, but then AEW will be above that for other shows.
That sounds right to me. As I'm looking here to see, do you know off the top of your head what the New Japan advances at the moment?
For Chicago, it's 5,000. But one of the qualifiers seems to be that when they were doing this in these waves, when the first wave sold out quickly, the second wave, it looks like a lot of ticket brokers were like, okay, let's get in. And it's over, I think it was over 1,000 tickets that are just ticket brokers. And now that they have the third wave, which is the upper deck, and that's selling slowly, I think 200 tickets a week.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly some novelty value for hardcore wrestling fans to come into Chicago if they're not already there and see an occasional peak show that is the authentic product that they watch on streaming that they can't see elsewhere. It does make you wonder, the movement of Okada and Ospreay over from New Japan to AEW. Yeah, it's probably the long term good thing to do if you're AEW. In one case, though, what's the value of Forbidden Door if you've already got all the top stars who were the novelties in the first two pay-per-views of Forbidden Door. What are you going to have left this coming June when they do Forbidden Door again? You got Naito over there, I guess, still, and there are others. But my point is the major stars are now your own full time.
So I believe you had an article about this at the same time that we were talking about a lot on the podcast, which is like, who is number 3, in the U.S. and like sort of. I think you could look at it like so many different ways because everyone has like a different business model and everyone's succeeding or challenged in different ways, right? GCW has this like ongoing touring, crisscrossing the U.S. and even the world in terms of smaller shows, smaller theaters, even coming, to Rochester soon, Brett's original hometown. And they have the Fight Plus deal, but we don't know what that really means, but it just does seem to allow them to do more. New Japan is here. They're under TNA, right? With Access, certainly just half of the ratings. They can do a few big shows, but that's sort of with the blessing or sort of contractual balance with AEW. And then you have TNA, which is under this corporate umbrella. And they have week-to-week ratings. They Eventbrite actually revealed some data, which I ran, which is that for Eventbrite shows which would be less than those when they run on Ticketmaster. It's been 200 people at each show on average the last 2 years. TNA people immediately got mad. But I'm just like, I just ran the numbers. Right? So,
how did you get access to that data? Like,
okay,
what did they out?
It was just like when you go to Eventbrite and you look at a wrestling promotion, sometimes they gift you with data. So for GCW, they've gifted us to say that 38% of the people that buy tickets are return buyers. MLW, 24% are return buyers. But for TNA, one day they gifted to say like, it was like 17,000 tickets sold. So I just looked at the past events, which might include meet and greets or whatever. But I just took that number and divided it up, and I was like 200. And when I looked at this a couple of years ago, in terms of counting maps and so on, that was the number that I came up with too. So I feel good about that 200 number without the outlier.
Sold, not just distributed.
Yeah, so Eventbrite would be sold. I'm sure on Eventbrite there's probably something where you can probably get a ticket without buying something, but I don't think that that's been the case with TNA. So this is like in their database, this is the total number that they have.
Okay. And so we think it's about 200 per show for TNA.
Yeah, 200 per show. So as my students know, a long roundabout way to get to the question again, which is, who do you think is number 3 in the U.S.?
What's the measure? Well, like, what's an appropriate measure for that?
I know that's a problem because everyone has a different measurement.
I guess there's, to the average person, name recognition is probably kind of their gauge, right? And that's TNA because it's in large part because it's been around so long. If you think about TV ratings, wow, no pun intended, wrestling's number 3, right? Because there's no other. WoW is averaging certainly well above what Impact and New Japan were, but I would not call WoW the third promotion, right? Certainly in terms of name recognition, in terms of
they feel like just a syndicated program at this point.
And I've never heard anybody talk about WoW really, outside of, I don't know, outside of our discussions.
Yeah. I would say outside of me.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about ticket sales, New Japan can do Wintrust Arena and distribute 5,000 tickets for this show, which is, when's the last time TNA did that? What's the biggest TNA attendance ever?
So I think was that in a very TNA-like fashion, I think it was the Astrodome. So they had a big attendance, but it was in a massive place, so it didn't mean anything. Let me see if I could get.
Was this with the when they had some of the Von Erichsen?
No, this was like older, like with Sting years before, sort of like that peak TNA year. So there's the like UK attendances, so you could like say like 10,000 or whatever, but like in the US, I believe it was 7,200. for sure we'll hear from TNA followers if this is off. But it's sort of like it's not much more. 8,100 is a number that's coming. So just about that. But these were like outliers. But I think in St. Louis for a while, like they had that like run where it was like 3 to 4,500. That wasn't like totally out of bounds. So like before, like I don't know, John, I don't want to blame Hulk Hogan, but before it was kind of broken around that time, that like 2008, 2011, they were putting up some good numbers, not week to week, but like you'd see some good numbers come out.
Yeah, and maybe you should put Ring of Honor in this discussion, although I kind of see Ring of Honor and all AEW as one. I guess there's no clean answer to it in terms of if you're talking just about name recognition, it's TNA. If we're talking about TV ratings, I guess technically it's WoW. If we're talking about attendance, it's New Japan, right?
Yeah, and I would say maybe, and this is like a different way of looking at it, but like in terms of like passionate, like hardcore buzz, people that are willing to like go to the shows in the hundreds, right, and tweet about it and so on. And whatever parameter is going on, subscribe to Fight Plus, then I think GCW has an argument there, and at times we have argued GCW is number 3.
Yeah, and I what you don't know is like how many U.S. subscribers are subscribing to New Japan World.
That hasn't come out in a while, right?
It's probably, I mean, the total number is probably over 100,000. I know at one point, what was it? Something like a third were outside Japan. I mean, it doesn't mean U.S., but outside Japan.
So, Brandon, for fear that you have a million things to do, I don't think we'll be able to go over this whole amazing report, but I do want to focus on an area that I kind of get a little bit confused on, and it's kind of fascinating to me as well. I'm not sure if you have it in front of you, but I wanted to reference the earnings and viewers per household. Let me see. What am I looking at the moment? Yeah.
So cost per viewer analysis.
So page 12, which includes the income levels of all rated pro wrestling, from WoW to New Japan to Impact and so on. So it's really fascinating because you have AEW, which people joke about, right? That 61,500 for AEW, and then you think Impact, it's also on cable, and sometimes maybe access even on a more expensive tier, right? So when you need to earn more money, 37,600. So that's a pretty stark difference, because I would think like a WoW, right? It's over the air, so if you're not going to spend extra money, you just watch it. So WoW earnings but they're still above Impact. So why do you think there's like such a discrepancy between an Impact and an AEW viewer earnings?
I don't know. If you look at I am looking at the page you're talking about. If you look down at the territory rows, where it breaks down viewership by territory, and the categories are East, Central, Northeast, Pacific, Southeast, Southwest, West Central. When I first got this data, I looked at it, and you get it's in a lighter way. It's sort of I don't know if you guys have heard the dichotomy between Succession, the TV show, and Yellowstone, where Yellowstone is by far like the most watched scripted show today in the U.S. But it gets probably a fraction of the media coverage that Succession gets, because of the subject matter of Succession and what people call coastal elites, like Succession, and they don't like Yellowstone as much. And I think maybe there's something similar happening with AEW in that there's like people on the coasts watch AEW disproportionately relative to WWE or other companies. I think there's maybe a regionality to it that may be a part of that, or a city rural divide that might be a part of that.
Actually, that's fascinating because 61,000, of course, it means something everywhere, but in metropolitan area New York City, it doesn't go very far. Quote, I'm holding up my quotes in case you're listening on the podcast. It doesn't go very far compared to what we think about, like in terms of the Midwest or even, different parts of New York State and so on. Yeah. So like, maybe it has to be like,
if you want to buy a house that you can afford, move to Buffalo.
Yeah. So maybe it has to be like, again, this is the premium content, right? Like that it's, you overlay it, what's the earnings per region, and then like, okay, like what are people really earning? But also advertisers that are buying a national ad, they want people that are earning a certain amount of money, right? That's really why it's important what it comes down to.
Maybe. I mean, all we have is the numbers and we can extrapolate ideas on top of them. But yes, and they are certainly used for fodder for, the tribal warfare between W fans and AW fans.
The meme where like there's the AW fan eating the triple cheeseburger. Like
he's in a real meme. Are you talking about a real meme?
Oh, I mixed up the meme and the images, right? Maybe it was just an image. But I was like, they're like, he's in his mom's basement. But I was like, yeah, but he's earning more money than the other fan. But awesome. This is so helpful. Let me turn over to John.
When you look at WWE right now with WrestleMania, do you need Rock in the main event to make the most amount of money, or is it okay that Cody Rhodes is in the main event because necessarily you could say it's probably already sold out both nights?
What's the incremental value that you get if you have Rock versus Reigns versus as opposed to Cody versus Reigns? What's the difference? You have more people watching on Peacock. So maybe that means you have more advertising and sponsor revenue, maybe. We're not in the pay-per-view business really anymore. I bet there still are some people ordering WrestleMania on pay-per-view, but primarily we're not in the pay-per-view business anymore. So I don't think that's worth entering into the conversation. Do you sell more tickets? Maybe slightly. I mean, most of these tickets are already sold.
Right.
So I see a greater long-term value in putting Cody in there because you're servicing your fans who you're going to generate money from for years, who are upset and feel just disgruntled about the notion that you've been teasing us with this story for like 2 years and we want the payoff and you're not going to give us this payoff. So yeah, I think it's the better thing to do to put Cody in there.
How do you feel about Cody's crybabies? Do you like that? Do you not like that? Does that sell some T-shirts for The Rock?
That's fine. I mean, like I think Rock gets it in that he's got an opportunity for some heel heat here, and I'm sure there are no shortage of annoying people on social media going after him. So why not? If it's leading to, I don't know where they're going storyline wise. If this is leading to a tag match or what. I sure hope Dwayne Johnson isn't planning on doing 2 matches because I feel like all of his muscles are going to explode on match 1, and he's not going to be able to perform the next night.
Right. Do you remember 10 years ago he got injured bad wrestling Cena? That was one match in a year.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think and he's not getting any younger, so I can't imagine they're planning for more than 1 match with him.
They got to somehow make sense of this, though. Cody's got the title shot, then he doesn't have the title shot. Now he's back in. This is bullshit. All this, they got to make sense of all that.
Yes, and most importantly of all, it's got to distract from the story around Vince.
Now, I was going to ask you that as well. Does that also play a factor into The Rock being such a big part of the programming? Distract? Hey, look over here. That kind of thing?
I think it's definitely happening. Whether how intentional that is, how premeditated that is, I don't know. I have thought about the timing of all this. The timing of all this is possible. I mean, you look at. I mean, you can even add Kevin Dunn's exit into it, and I've no strong sense other than circumstantially the timing looks right. He leaves at the very end of the year. He's one of Vince's closest allies, right? There were issues apparently based on Mark Shapiro going out to a media conference and saying, my production chiefs are fighting with me about cost cutting.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's I'm sure there's other factors, and I don't know that the Vince thing is a factor at all, but it could be. And then you have the Observer reporting that on January 3rd, the deal was made for Rock to do WrestleMania. It's not inconceivable that Vince and WWE didn't have a heads up by that point that sometime soon there's going to be a lawsuit dropping. Now nobody knows the details of it, I imagine, but I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe they could have gotten a draft of the complaint. I don't know. But I do see it as like, I could see it being the case that, we know that bad news is going to come out, and wouldn't it be good to have Dwayne Johnson as one of the public faces of this company? The most conspicuous thing to me, beyond the timing, is the deal that Dwayne got to be on the board. $30 million in equity, all of his IP. And we talked about this the day that happened, which is 2 days before the lawsuit comes out. That's an enormous deal. Well, I as an investor, I would be, which I'm not an investor, I would be like, why are we giving away IP, and why are we giving him $30 million? He's qualified to be on the board. We're not doing that for any other board member. We're not giving them $30 million in equity and the commensurate value of the Rock's intellectual property. Why are we doing that? If they were over a barrel and they really needed some help, maybe that's why they did that. I don't know. Maybe there's a conflict of interest in having Ari Emanuel, who's worked and represented Dwayne Johnson throughout his movie career, negotiate that deal with Dwayne. I don't, but I think there are a lot of questions around that.
Ari also was Vince's agent too, so very interesting. His involvement, what he knew or didn't know about all this stuff is I mean, it's all speculation, but it's very interesting to try to figure out what's going on with that.
So did Ari work like as a talent agent for Vince?
Yeah. For I think 20 years or 25 years, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. So like what deals would that be associated with then?
I don't know, because it said that Vince was doing, I guess, some sort of other outside ventures, but I can't think of any other than some businesses.
The Vince McMahon movies. I haven't seen those.
Yeah, exactly. But it was like WME, which was Ari, whatever. He like represented him for 25 years. But I was thinking, it's like, well, representing him for what? Like, necessarily, because he's not out there as,
Are you sure they weren't just referring to like Endeavor has had various partnerships with WWE in terms of they do the on location, the travel packages with WWE. They've been doing streaming. Maybe they've had other associations, but was it?
I could have sworn I read it was Vince. It was Vince and him that was his agent for 25 years. So for whatever reason, I don't know what he would need him for, but other than a strong business partner or a strong alliance.
Yeah.
When you look at The Rock, like you were saying with that deal, he gets his IP, everything else. Does that mean he also has creative control, brother? You know what I mean? Is he also calling the shots creatively?
I don't know. We don't have anything that looks like Hulk Hogan or Bret Hart creative control disclosed as part of this. He's a member of the board. Does that make him outrank certain people like Paul Levesque? No, not necessarily. It does give him some additional influence, but a board member is there, in my understanding. He's an independent board member. He's not an executive. I know this is something that I think people get easily confused, right? Is being a member of the board is not the same thing as working for WWE full time or being an executive. Some executives are also board members, including Nick Khan. But a board is supposed to be made up of largely independent members who don't work for your company full time, who are supposed to be able to judge this company independently and decide whether the CEO is doing a good job and decide how much to pay the CEO and advise the company on how it should be run. Now, does he have influence over Ari Emanuel, who does outrank Paul Levesque? Perhaps. And it was not inconceivable that if Paul Levesque were to leave WWE someday, that that The Rock and Brian Gewirtz wouldn't have a great deal of influence on who takes over the vacancy.
I was going to say, when you look at it, if he has a head writer that used to be the head writer, 20 years ago, but still was the head writer, and you have a booker who maybe you don't want him in anymore, and The Rock has all his power. Hey, isn't your guy a good writer? And like Gewirtz can almost replace Triple H as the booker. You know what I mean? Like if certain things happen, The Rock could have a ton of influence creatively and behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, he has a long relationship with the CEO of the company, which is Ari Emanuel.
And another high-ranking executive, Nick Khan. You know what I mean? He's buddies with him for God knows how long, 40 years or whatever. Yes, it's crazy.
That's right.
Crazy.
Back in
Crazy.
Hawaii, yeah.
Yeah, crazy all the inner workings of all these guys. You go back to 96, you think The Rock and Triple H, these two guys, these mid-card guys, yeah, they basically run the company now. It's pretty nuts. But as far as WrestleNomics and the annual report, where can everybody see it and what can they look forward to when they're reading this?
The report is on PayHip. So if you go to, there isn't a great way to link this. It's on WrestleNomics.com on the right-hand bar. But you can also just get access to it if you're a subscriber at patreon.com/WrestleNomics. But it is a 37-page report. It's basically a good summary or introduction to the wrestling business. I think it's especially good for people who are not necessarily wrestling fans. We're probably not listening right now, but people who are not necessarily wrestling fans and they just want to understand the business for business reasons or for some reason to understand what they're getting into here. But it goes over mainly WWE, AEW, some New Japan, and a little bit of TNA, going over TV ratings, going over TV rights fees, attendance, social media, and going over the demographics of all the TV ratings, and giving a little bit of a look too into the wider media landscape in terms of household coverage of all the networks that are now hosting wrestling content. And
I have been asked of our listeners. Sorry, Brandon, I didn't mean to cut you off. That I'm looking at the WrestleNomics Patreon right now, and as of this recording, it's $8.93. So Brandon, to get Brandon back, right? He's been here so many times. We have to show him the power of the business podcast. So a week after this drops, we want to see that 900 or above.
That is a total number. Well, this would be like the W Network saying we've got so many millions of subscribers and we're including the free ones in there. Patreon has started to do something different where they're like they're letting people follow Patreon accounts. So if you're posting public stuff, which I sometimes do post public stuff, but so the number of paid subscribers I have is like 650 roughly right now.
So 660. That's what we're aiming for. Don't just go for the free one. You know, it's not everything's a free lunch, people.
I got to reveal this though, Brandon, because you mentioned something before. Lavi, sorry, I have to do this, but there is one person on here that will be ordering WrestleMania via pay-per-view, and it's not me or you. So he will order traditional means.
Yeah, Brandon, I'm not sure if you heard the episode, but I ordered the Royal Rumble via traditional pay-per-view. My son was like so shocked about what this was. He immediately reported to my wife that I spent $45. So
it's only $45.
Yeah, on Optimum, the Dolan service.
Okay, interesting.
So if I order, I could probably only get away with one night.
Brandon, where can everybody follow you social media wise?
You can harass me on social media at Brandon Thurston or at WrestleNomics. I have a TikTok now for WrestleNomics. That's the big thing. I think there's less than 100 followers on it, but there are ratings. If you choose to get your ratings from some means other than formerly known as Twitter, X, then there are ratings. The same rating. Well, the basic ratings information is on Instagram as well as TikTok. Every day, it's out there.
I love it. And you can follow me at 2Man Power Trip on Instagram and X, if you will. Lavi, what about you?
Follow me on Twitter or X, right? Laviemarg, LAVIEMARG, and join our Business of the Business LinkedIn group, the best business group of its kind on LinkedIn.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. See you right back here next week for a little Business of the Business. We'll see you next week, folks.